It's great to be with you all, and thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I have to say that my children and even my grandchildren, I think it's somewhat hilarious that I'm in any way involved with technology, because I'm not particularly au fait with the digital world, believe it or not. But I have come to find that a digital approach could potentially help us solve one of the biggest challenges of our time, as long as it's done in an evidence-based way. So more of that to follow. But as you can see here on the slide, this is a Radcliffe camera in Oxford. I'm speaking to you from Oxford, not more than about 300 yards from that beautiful building, which is part of Oxford's history. It's not, unfortunately, where I do my research work or do my teaching normally. It's just a beautiful building. It's part of the Oxford landscape. I've worked for Oxford, with Oxford, for the past 10 or 12 years, helping them establish their sleep medicine research program and their clinical sleep medicine training programs. I do most of that remotely, actually. I actually live in Scotland, but just to prove, I do come down and speak to the English. You know, these rivalries are always there. But so this is some of my background credentials. I'm a clinical psychologist by training and a professor of sleep medicine at Oxford. But the reason I guess that I'm asked to speak today is about some of the insights, if you like, that I've gained over a number of years in terms of how we can get cognitive behavioral therapy out there at scale. And in an effort to try and push that agenda forward, I co-founded a company called Big Health, and we involved in developments in sleep and generalized anxiety disorder and youth depression. But there is, of course, a conflict of interest here. So I want to, declare that right at the beginning of this talk. I'm actually not going to refer that often to our products themselves. I want us to think more in terms of the bigger picture about what digital therapeutics or digital CBT might be able to help us do in terms of scaling a psychological care to guideline psychological care for the whole population. If you're interested, this is a bit of an old slide because it's no longer Twitter, is it? But if you want to follow me, I'm at Prof. SB on Z or whatever it's called nowadays. Okay, so I want to tell you the end of the story, or the take-home message right at the beginning, and that is that providing that digital therapeutics are developed, refined, and rigorously tested, just like any other putative treatment, there is actually the potential to close a very long-standing gap in service provision. That really means that we could potentially develop an ecosystem of evidence-based psychological care that's equivalent in scope to pharmacotherapy, and thus offer people a choice of evidence-based care. So it's really about providing people with choice for any other disorder or any other treatment beyond mental health. Probably people would be alarmed to think that my treatment's not available to me. It's in the guidelines, but I just can't get it. Imagine if that was the case for cancer care, for the sake of argument. But of course, in mental health care, the only thing we really have readily available is medication. It's something that people could be given today, immediately, and at scale. So the future vision in this little town we're calling Choice, it might involve an ecosystem of psychological care. My journey really began, I'm not going to give you a very lengthy history of my own professional career, but I qualified as a clinical psychologist in 1980, at a time when, CBT had never been, it wasn't a term that had ever been invented. There were behavioral treatments, behavioral interventions, and the beginnings of thinking how a psychological approach could potentially benefit the population at large. And my very first job was in primary care, seeing people with anxiety, depression, other things. And it was in the context of working in primary care that a GP said to me one day, "Colin, you seem to be doing a lot of work with people who are anxious or depressed, which is great, but can you not do anything to help these people who can't sleep?" And I said, "I don't know. Nobody taught me about that. Send me a few people and I'll see what we can do." And I published my first randomized controlled trial looking at different treatments for insomnia, stimulus control treatment, relaxation treatment, cognitive therapy treatment in the form of paradoxical intention, a placebo group and a waitlist group. In other words, we had all these discrete treatments. And, I think one of the things that's happened, unfortunately, in a way, is we've now come to the point of lumping so many things together in CBT that we think CBT is a treatment. CBT isn't a treatment, it's a family of therapeutics. And I've come to use the term cognitive and behavioral therapeutics, or CBTX, just to emphasize the point that we're talking about a family or a formulary of therapeutics. We could call it a number of other things around the circle here, psychotherapy or evidence-based psychological therapy. But, CBT is kind of what I'm talking about, but it's not a thing, it's multiple things. And therefore, I think one of the challenges we have is how do we develop at population scale a formulary out of CBTX that provides the equivalent of a drug formulary with all its different pharmaceuticals in it that can be made available to people today. In contrast to medication provision, the psychological approach is pretty much a cottage industry when you think of the numbers of people who are treated by it. But that isn't really consistent with the guidelines. Now, we're going to go back to those, but I just want to kind of emphasize what I was saying there about a system of therapeutics. If we were to look at, again, just using insomnia as an example, we would see that there are a family of drugs called benzodiazepine receptor agonists, and there are different active molecules in that, and these are discrete treatments. And likewise, there are new dual orexin receptor agonists, all different drugs. But actually, these drugs are kind of similar to each other, and these drugs are kind of similar to each other, but we happily see them as separate treatments. And I think that's my vision for cognitive and behavioral therapeutics, that we don't just have CBT as the treatment, we have, branching lines that separate each of the components into its components, like relaxation could be divided into progressive relaxation, autogenic training, biofeedback, even auto-hypnosis. But then each of these could be branched into different things. And you get the equivalent of zopiclone or zolpidem or izopiclone or whatever. In other words, you get lots of choices within the toolbox of the CBT formulary. The evidence base for cognitive and behavioral therapeutics is long-standing, and it's pretty enormous. I think the first study, or one of the very first randomized controlled trials, was published by Gelder and Marks in the British Journal of Psychiatry in 1966. So we have many, many decades of evidence for therapeutics that might treat common mental health conditions. And we're now in a situation all these years later where cognitive and behavioral therapies are recommended commonly as first-line treatments alongside drugs. That you may start here, you may start here depending on patient need. That's true if you look at the NICE guidelines in the UK, the National Institutes for Health and Care Excellence publish guidelines that really lead to the commissioning of treatments, including drugs, in the UK. So this NICE guideline refers to pharmacotherapy or psychological therapy, CBT, for depression. And they're both equally evidenced for mild to moderate depression. Similarly, in the States, you have guidelines that are very much consistent with that through different organizations. And you can see some examples of that here. Equally, we could look at the management of anxiety disorder and panic disorder. There's guidelines in the UK, again, saying you can use a psychological approach or you can use a pharmacological approach. You may begin wherever you think is most appropriate. Both are evidence-based first-line care. Same in the States. You've got American Psychiatric Association. You've got the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, countless guidelines and meta-analysis systematic reviews guiding clinical practice. The reason I'm highlighting all this is because in practice, as you'll realize, that although we've got all these guidelines there, this is not actually what happens in practice because the psychological treatments are not available as quickly or as widely. The same would be true for PTSD. Here's the guidelines in the UK and the guidelines in the States. And insomnia, my area, nice guideline, the management of insomnia, and guidelines, for managing insomnia from the Annals of Internal Medicine, and recently from the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. All essentially saying the same thing. There are two starting points one can take with a patient depending upon their need and their choice. Actually, in the case of insomnia, the guidelines say we should start first line with CBT and drugs second line. But in the other ones, they're both first line. Now, more evidence matters, right? I've spent my whole career, I give you the example, I first randomized control trial. We've been involved in trials programs looking at CBT for insomnia and other disorders, across my career, and many of my colleagues worldwide doing the same thing. We always need more evidence. It's always valuable, but we need to figure out ways to provide guideline care to the entire population. It's not a great comfort to someone with a depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, insomnia, or whatever it may be, to realize there's different ways in which this may be treated, but actually they're not equally available. If we look at the World Health Organization Constitution, it envisages, and it's maybe a rather lofty standard, but it envisages the highest attainable standard of health as a fundamental right of every human being. And I think for many other conditions, particularly physical health conditions, the population at large would be very, very concerned, if not up in arms, to think that the treatment that is evidence-based and should be for me is simply not available. Now, historically, there's only been one scalable solution, and that is to take medication. And I think this has been framed really very unhelpfully, to be honest, because we don't actually, in my view, have an overprescribing problem. What we have is an under-provision problem of anything else. And what that leads to is, quite rightly, that medication is provided much more frequently than psychological care. That's the reason for it. It's not overprescribing. It's the under-provision of a scalable alternative to doing that. And of course, if you're depressed, you want help today, don't you? And if there's millions of you, or tens of millions of you, then you're not going to easily access psychological care that's evidence-based. And we need evidence-based care. So inevitably, people then often start on antidepressants. I am in no way, shape, or form against pharmaceuticals. I think it's fantastic that we have evidence-based treatment. I'm ashamed, in some ways, that we haven't solved this under-provision problem, despite decades and decades and decades of evidence that cognitive behavioral therapy works. It's bridging this gap in meeting mental health guidelines in particular. And I don't know what the actual figures are, but I estimate that you've probably got a one-to-one chance of getting an active treatment if you've got a good going depression, anxiety, insomnia, post-traumatic stress disorder. You see your doctors, there's a pretty good chance you're going to get treated, right? And treated quickly. Most people will. I know there's other barriers that I'm not going into here. I'm just trying to make this general point, all things being equal. But your chances of getting evidence-based psychological care as first line is, I don't know, 1,000 to 1. Maybe that's optimistic. But I'm using that statistic just to make a point that this chance here is red dot, is one out of very, very many. And of course, the chances of getting choice are very unequally distributed in communities, because you need to be resourceful or have resources often to work the system in order to get that choice in practice. So in effect, the CBT, or cognitive and behavioral therapeutics gap, is actually bridged, thankfully, by pharmacotherapy. There's a treatment for you. Many people refer to the UK NHS IAP services. You may be familiar with this, improving access to psychological therapies. NHS talking therapies. And there's been huge investments in this. And David Clark, who's a colleague, of mine here in Oxford, has done a tremendous amount of work, and huge amounts of money have been spent by NHS England to try and bridge the gap, to try and increase access to psychological care. And inroads have been made. But just take a look at the statistics here. 2023 is the 15th anniversary year of this NHS talking therapy service being commissioned. And last year, 665,000 people were treated in 2022. More than 10,000 therapists and practitioners are now being trained. But look at this. The stated goal of that service, that nationally funded service, the stated goal is to increase access to 25% of those in need, leaving 75% of people without access to that choice. Great credit to what's happened, but kind of proves the point that even with massive investment and massive training efforts, people still don't have choice of getting these guideline alternatives, not at population level anyway. So commendable it is, there's still a problem. And when it's a problem, it's really important to define very clearly what is the problem to be solved. The problem to be solved isn't trying to improve situations or to increase numbers of therapists and clinicians. Of course, we must do that, and I'll say something about that. The problem to be solved is how do you actually provide evidence-based psychological therapy kind of for everyone today, at least to make it an alternative for all the millions of people who turn up worldwide with these different conditions and needs. So if we think about this man, Henry Ford, I don't know if this is actually a quote from Henry Ford. I didn't get a chance to ask him, but it's attributed to him anyway, isn't it? That he said that if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, that was going to be the solution. And in a way, I think that is what we've been doing in psychological care for decades. We've been trying to create faster horses. Clinicians who work more efficiently, working with more people, training more people, all that's brilliant, right? But the innovator says, well, that's not going to solve the problem, because he invented the motor car, right? We had to find another way of getting from A to B. And if you look at this man, Steve Jobs, he kind of actually says that if you define the problem correctly, you almost have the solution. In other words, we have to spend more time in being clearer at what the solution is, what the problem is, so that you can then find the solution. And the problem is finding an evidence-based treatment that's psychologically based that can be provided to everyone today at the same scale of pharmaceuticals, if you've got a choice of alternatives. Imagine if you had chemotherapy and radiotherapy, evidence-based for the treatment of cancer, but you said, well, actually, only 25% of the population can get radiotherapy because it's just not available. I mean, it would be seen as unthinkable. We'd have to find a way of bridging this gap. Okay, so what is the problem with respect to population provision of CBT? I mentioned professional training and dissemination of skills. It is hugely important. I don't want anything I say today to take away from the importance of services that are led by and governed by professional standards and integrity, rules and regulatory authorities. I don't want anything to take away from that. We need to have professional training and dissemination of skills. We need to have centers of excellence that are leading on this. We need to have professional societies that are leading on this. We need to have training organizations that are leading on this. The actual activities of training and the standards required for training people, to benchmark standards. We can't solve the problem by diluting evidence or by diluting effort. or by treating nobody very well. We have to treat everyone according to standards. And there's a great deal of activity that's going on in these areas. And just for example, just in the States, centers of excellence like the Beck Institute, there's many others. Professional societies like the American Psychological Association, there's many others. Training organizations in cognitive and behavioral therapies. In the World Confederation has not just got the AABT, I think it's got something like 15 international organizations. Huge amounts of effort going into training, more people aware, psychologically aware, more people skilled, more people able to deliver evidence-based cognitive and behavioral therapeutics. Wonderful. We should be doing that. And in Oxford, for example, and you know that my particular area of interest is sleep disorders, we've developed an online program in sleep medicine because nobody trained me in sleep, as I said earlier on. But people are still saying to us, hey, we think sleep's much more important than is covered in our medical school or professional training. We need more training. So we've set up an online master's program, and we've trained people from 35 countries and 13 health-related disciplines over recent years. So absolutely, let's keep trucking with training. And let's keep developing scalable tools that we have used before. So the digital world is not going to replace those things. The challenge in some ways, how do we integrate it into this? Therapy manuals for practitioners. I did a whole series of studies in the 2000s, which were about training nurses to deliver a cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia in groups. We trained nurses who worked in primary care. We trained nurses who worked in oncology. They did the interventions. We trained them. They provided the interventions. So we were training 5 or 6 people for the equivalent of one treatment session per week, because they were in a group, and they were trained by health visitors and practice nurses and so on, oncology nurses. So we were spreading skills. Group therapy is somewhat more scalable than individual therapy. But you know where I'm going with this. We keep training people. We train more and more people are aware, more and more people are interested, more and more people are looking for the treatment. It's not necessarily more available. Another thing that we can do and is write books and provide the manualized treatment approaches. And these are just some of the ones that I've been involved with, but there's many of these. And there's so many clinicians who are dedicated to try and disseminate knowledge and skills. Wonderful. We've also got a fairly good repository now of self-help bibliotherapy books, which can be used directly by people, by patients, to follow evidence-based programs, CBD, for lots of conditions. And I've done that too. But I have to say, of course, it's not really, it's not really an academic pursuit, writing these self-help books. It's almost like, well, that's not perhaps what we should be doing. We should be doing more research. But I think it's another way of disseminating things. All this is grist to the mill. But here's the rub. Here's the key thing. What we need more than anything is a wider range of transporter systems. This, I think, is the primary problem. How do we develop a transporter system for CBT that is safe and clinically effective? Drugs have been a great success. Medication, pharmacotherapy has been a great success because it can be administered by many routes: orally, sublingually, nasally, topically, injectables, et cetera, et cetera. But you have to imagine that if standard care for depression was injectable SSRI, it would not be scalable to the number of people who need that treatment. It's the fact that we can do this using oral medications that makes it scalable. And what we have here on the right is that CBT may be administered by several routes. We can see people individually. We can see people in groups. We can see people in larger groups. I don't size as a group, but a larger group. We can use teletherapy, but we can use text and phone and online. We can use bibliotherapy. We can enhance our in-person care using digital approaches to make it more efficient. We can train many other people, so we get more therapists to deliver all of this. But my contention is, and I said at the beginning, that I'm no expert in digital, but it seems to me that at the moment, it is only fully automated digital, which we commonly call digital therapeutics, that is a transporter system for CBT that is actually scalable to the same level as medications are. In other words, scalability, if you like, if we look at the pharmacotherapy toolbox, the scalable proposition for population level need is tablets, is pills. The scalable proposition for CBT at the moment, and it may change in a few years, who knows, but right now, it seems to be software as a medical device, software-only devices. I'm not talking about, wearables and all that kind of stuff. I'm talking just about the software side of it. So the insight here, I would suggest, is that psychologists aren't scalable. However, psychology is potentially scalable. That is, the constructs, the concepts, the procedures associated with psychological theory and practice, they're not intrinsically limited to in-person communication. And they may actually be suitable for use in digital interventions. So, digital cognitive behavioral therapeutics may have a similar range of properties that we find in oral medication. That is, scalable, you can reproduce them. Affordable, because there's, economies of scale. Evidence-based, and this is a crucial bit that we're going to spend a bit of time thinking about. And to some degree standardized such that they can be recognizable and consistent. If we can do that with digital therapeutics, then we have the potential, I think, to make a big, big difference. Now, around this whole area, there's an industry growing as we speak. And there's an organization called the Digital Therapeutics Alliance, which is organizations like our own, Big Health, and many others who are involved in exploring this whole area and have offered this kind of definition that digital therapeutics is really a new category of medicine that delivers medical interventions directly to patients using evidence-based, clinically evaluated software to treat, manage, and prevent a broad spectrum of diseases and disorders. Just in the same way as we are well familiar with the fact that you can buy something in the store that looks like a tablet and is a pill, but we can differentiate that from a treatment. Because we know that's maybe a lifestyle medicine, that's something we picked, we paid for ourselves, don't necessarily expect it to be reimbursed, we don't necessarily expect it to be recommended, don't necessarily expect it to be in guidelines. We understand that pill and that pill are completely different. If we're going to really evolve digital therapeutics, we have to understand that this app and this app are completely different. And I think that will come in time. There's a Society for Digital Mental Health that's recently been formed within the last couple of years and had its 3rd annual conference, I think, this year. There's a book that came out recently on digital therapeutics, and we contributed, or I contributed with colleagues to that book. And it's about thinking about what the scientific, what the statistical, what the clinical, what the regulatory aspects and constraints associated with this new industry and these new products of these new product therapeutics. And one of the things I'm very keen to impress on everyone is that I don't believe there's a need to reinvent the wheel here. Designing and delivering a digital therapeutics clinical research program should, in my view, at least for now, just do the hard yards. Just make sure that we're following the same pattern that we use to create evidence-based products. And don't use fallacious arguments that don't wash, for example, in pharmaceuticals. You can't imagine a situation where it says antidepressants treat depression effectively. Oh, this new product is an antidepressant. Therefore, this new product treats depression effectively. No, you don't get to do that. You don't get to say, well, I've synthesized a new SSRI. SSRIs work, so my drug works. You don't get to do that. You have to demonstrate per therapeutic that this is an effective treatment. And likewise, I don't think we should be saying that CBT treats depression effectively. We've created a product that contains CBT. We've put in an app. Therefore, this product treats depression effectively. That's, if you like, an evidence-informed way. And it's a misuse of the construct evidence-informed. We need evidence-based products per product, in my view. And if you want to read more about that, there was a piece that we wrote last year, Joseph Firth in Manchester, John Torres in Harvard, and myself. Digital therapeutics also need to be evidence-based, not just evidence-informed. It's really important that when we're treating patients, we treat the needs with respect. Yeah, that'd be obvious to any clinician. It should be obvious to any citizen. But what that means is if we're creating a category of digital therapeutics, the members of that category must be evidence-based like any other treatment. Otherwise, people will be potentially misled. There's an app for that. As John Torres wrote a recent article, there's a non-evidence-based app for that. It's a great read. And there's a lot of confusion out there at the moment about this. Governance is crucially important. And I'd refer you to this piece as well in Health Affairs Forefront that I wrote with John Torres and Troy Brennan, who at the time was a chief medical officer of CVS Caremark, the pharmacy benefits provider. The digital therapeutics need to be regulated with gold standard evidence. As I said earlier on, this shouldn't really be rocket science. If you're delivering treatments, it should be evidence-based, just like anything else. Why? Well, I've had to go through this with people sometimes. Say, well, why do you need to have a clinical research program? We want to be agile and break things, and we want to make apps and learn quickly and go fast, and we have to give them out to people in order to do that. Well, you can do that in the well-being space, but please do not do that in the mental health space. People with depression are every bit as important as people with other conditions, and they have to have treatments that work. A treatment needs to go through a clinical research program because you need to test if a treatment's safe and effective. Do you need to test if the treatment is safe and effective? Well, patient needs effective treatments for the medical conditions. Do patients need effective treatments for the medical conditions? Medical conditions are important to patients. Are they important to patients? Medical conditions impair people's lives, health and well-being. Does impairment to a patient's health and well-being matter? You kidding me? It's central to the person's quality of life. To me, this is patently obvious, but believe me, it's not entirely obvious to many people in this space right now. You might want to look at this, what criteria. It's in that Health Affairs Forefront paper, but my plea is that therapeutics have to be demonstrated to work, from an efficacy point of view, inadequately powered pre-randomized controlled trials, with registered primary outcomes, not cherry picking. But more than that, these interventions also have to help people. So the W, the H, and the what criteria. That is, it's not just about, hey, we found a significant difference between group effects. We have to demonstrate important differences over an adequate control condition. In other words, we need to demonstrate, if we're delivering clinical guideline care, we have to be able to demonstrate that we're delivering clinically meaningful benefit to patients. Otherwise, what's the point in doing it? It's entirely moot. It's also really important that the therapeutics are truly accessible. And I think that's where things being fully automated, software as a medical device, matters. But also the products that are developed need to be scalable to the level that they could be delivered, nationally and internationally to millions of people. We can't be developing therapeutics organizations, companies that go bust in a month or a year or take their money and run. A lot of the treatments that we use in mental health have been around for a long, long time. We talked about SSRIs, for example. It's still the mainstay of treatment in depression and indeed in generalized anxiety disorder. They're not new treatments. But imagine if the companies that developed those had disappeared. Or suppose SSRIs just disappeared. Oh, sorry, we don't have that anymore. So therefore, it's not just about creating things that work and that help, but they have to be accessible and remain accessible in the longer run. And also they have to be trusted. And there's a lot of misunderstanding around the whole digital space at the moment about what is a well-being offering, what is a treatment, and differentiating between those two things. Trust is a killer for anything in healthcare. If we don't trust it, it's not just that thing that we don't trust, but we cease to trust the ecosystem that recommended it to us. And that is a horrifying thought. So the way that we prevent that, the way we mitigate that, is by doing things properly and having properly regulated therapeutics, industries, and standards, and just requiring that those are met. And it's possible to do that. I haven't really said very much about Sleepio, and I'm not going to go into it in detail, but people say, oh, it's too difficult, it's hard, or how do you create control conditions and whatever. That's the problem to solve. You can create fully automated interventions like Sleepio. You can put them through multiple trials. Sleepio, since its first placebo-controlled trial, was published in 2012. There's been 14, there's another 13 randomized controlled trials and 40 plus published evidence papers. It's possible to do this. It takes hard work to build an intervention or an industry that is going to be worthwhile. But I imagine that sometimes the hard things are the things that are worth doing, and that we shouldn't just be going for easy options. And some of you might know that Sleepio, I referred earlier to NICE guidelines in the UK, that Sleepio was given a NICE guideline in May of last year as recommended as a cost-saving alternative in primary care to patients who would otherwise receive sleeping pills or sleep hygiene. And here's the irony. The guidelines already said that CBT was the guideline care, but now they can say it's possible to actually do it because we have a digital therapeutic that could be given to millions of people. It's feasible to actually do it. You see the headline in the Times, doctors give sleep app rather than pills. So it's about helping us helping all the stakeholders, who are clinicians, who are researchers, who are patients, who are healthcare systems, all these different stakeholders have got to be helped to understand, what we mean by digital therapeutics and how it could potentially make a difference, and also how it integrates into our services. Because it's not out with the old, it's developing the new. And medicine has always evolved. It's hugely different than it used to be in all quarters. Step care may be one aspect of that. It could be, a model to build things on. At some level, we need to think about what are the bottom-up services that people require, and top-down, how do we develop systems of care where we can integrate digital therapeutics into the care system. to become part of that care system while still making them accessible to people. And it may be that them being behind a prescription a pad isn't ideal for that. Maybe we have to think about ways in which the therapeutics can safely and effectively be made available to people more readily than that, as well as being things that can be recommended. And there's all kinds of regulatory stuff involved in this, which I don't underestimate. But if we're actually going to, I can skip that slide. If we're actually going to deliver guideline care, my contention is the current best candidate for helping us to do that is to see the algorithm as being the kind of equivalent of the molecule. That the algorithm is like the way in which programming can develop software as a medical device that could faithfully deliver in an evidence-based way cognitive and behavioral therapeutics and become scalable in the same way as the molecule is able to do that in pharmacotherapy. This is where I started. Providing that digital therapeutics, and there's a caveat, providing they're developed, refined, and rigorously tested like any other putative treatment, I think there is potential to use this approach to close a long-standing gap in service provision and develop an ecosystem of psychological care where digital therapeutics becomes part of that. It doesn't overwhelm it. Somehow it becomes part of that and might then become equivalent in scope to pharmacotherapy, which we need. And indeed, they're not alternatives. We might sometimes need both. But that future avenue junction with Vision Street, it may be one way of offering choice to people. And I suggest that it's something that you might want to consider. And hopefully, listening to what I've had to say today is going to help your consideration of that. Yeah, thank you very much indeed.
Colin, very fascinating, very fascinating. For those of us who spend our lives on college campuses with 40,000 students, and this sleep hygiene in particular has been a big issue after sleep hygiene in particular has become a big issue after COVID. And it's very fascinating. I may take the liberty of of asking you a few questions.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yes.
First question, and you talked about trust. And trust is a relative construct in the sense Europe has a very different approach to privacy issues than the US does.
Yes.
And so how do you go about building trust in patient, clinicians, caregivers, where these kind of privacy concerns are so paramount? You have all your data going out there.
Yes, that's a great point, and I can't recall the paper right now, but there is there's an article that kind of looks at the whole question of trust, and of course, trust is usually a multifaceted thing. One aspect is what are you doing with my data, but there's many other aspects to trust as well. Because as a general construct, it's part of the therapeutic relationship of do no harm, right? So there are ISO standards. There are heavily regulated kind of standards in the technology industry, which we're already using in our company, and I think other companies are doing the same. It does require a team to be on this, and it is important that we take it very, very seriously. When I think integration, in some ways, rather than separateness from medical record systems, is key. It can't just be something that's off in the cloud on its own, ultimately unrelated to any other kind of record that this individual and their needs. The system needs to, in the end, try and look at a person's healthcare needs in the round. I don't think we're at that stage yet, but I think that's where it needs to be. And I think, when people see that the digital space is regulated, has the same levels of standards of certification, as other aspects of medical and psychological care, then they will begin to trust it more. But I think there's also an issue of trust just because it's new, it's different, because the digital space broadly and social media and so on is not something that people necessarily trust, that it becomes lumped together with that, and it's seen as part of that category of run fast, break things, get it wrong, etc. We're talking about something different here. We're talking about go steadily, safely, securely. We're talking about a different approach to that, and it's certainly, when I'm speaking to people who are interested in getting into this space, discouraging them in a way, from being naive about clinical standards, about patient requirements, and about the kind of back door, if you like. How are you making sure this is safe and secure? And they say, well, I've only got $100,000 of startup funds, and I want to create an app and get it out to people. I say, well, how are you going to do a clinical trial on that? Oh, do I need to do a clinical trial? You think, well, if you're going to be in this space, that's what's going to be required. And the trust bit is absolutely key to it.
Yeah, it comes in the context of what's happening with generative AI. Even as we speak, this whole open AI thing is imploding because of the lack of guardrails.
Yes.
And it will be an interesting. Now, is your Sleepio, for example, anchored to diagnosis? Meaning, do you create digital phenotypes on the people who use it and then titrate the CBT? How does that work? I haven't used your app, so.
Yes, so there's personalization within the program, but it's not as highly evolved as it can be. When one thinks of personalized medicine, and one thinks of it, as it were, personalized behavioral medicine as an extension of that. I said at the beginning, Vivek, that CBT is already an amalgam of loads and loads of different things.
Right.
Does everyone need to get everything? What is going to help this individual make the fastest progress? What's going to meet their phenotypical presentation? What's the starting point? And I think there's a very rich future in how we evolve that over time to create that personalized journey for individuals. Our programs do that to some degree at the moment, but I think this is where the future lies. Personalizing things even more. I think sometimes when one thinks of primary care, where people probably the time to treatment, the wait time to treatment is the shortest. You go and see your GP or whatever, and you're given you spend a short period of time there probably, and may leave with an antidepressant. Some people might advocate, well, you need to do a whole history. You have to do everything first. I think we've got to figure out what is the safest accessible route to care for an individual while we continue to assess their needs as part of the journey, rather than front-ending everything with reams and reams of assessments and exclusions and so on. These are things I think we need to navigate. But those things are actually already happening in healthcare. We have to find, how do we do that in a digital equivalent of that? It may be that it's a qualified referral into the program in the first place, or it may be that the program is providing information back to the clinical team about response to treatment, for example, which is often a useful indicator. This is all to play for. I'm here today to say, from a innovation perspective in healthcare, there's huge opportunities. We've realized some of them. I've shared a few of them, but I'm trying to be agnostic, if you like, to our particular. Happy to share our experiences, of course, as I'm doing, but I'm not saying we're doing it perfectly, and I'm not saying we've always got the best example of things. What I'm doing is saying it takes hard work, effort, and some of the things that people kind of reject out of hand is we could never do that. They can be done. You can create placebo conditions and test something against a placebo control. And after all, it's even more important potentially, because psychological manipulation is that, a drug is a different thing, and yet there's a placebo effect. And conversely, of course, psychological interventions have biological effects. So it's not like psychology versus biology. The two systems, if you like, have got very common features associated with them.
True, and to your core thesis of the excitement is the fact that it's scalable and it has a population level impact. But then you're talking about very diverse populations with different levels of technology, literacy, different levels of access.
Yes.
And certainly I've just curious, like, have you any of those studies have gone in very large population levels, or they are usually circumscribed by the number of accessible patients?
Well, I mean, I had a slide earlier that told the number of people that have been randomized into studies. I mean, typically our studies will have 300 or 400 people in them, but we've had studies where we've had many thousands in them, because you can actually enroll people very quickly into studies like this. So it is possible to do it. I think the scalability thing, it does kind of demand, in a sense, the need for sizable studies, because if we're talking about creating an intervention approach that is going to potentially benefit many people, then in the end you want to be able to combine studies, do meta-analytic studies, so you can interrogate things over in the round, and not necessarily just one product, or it could be across a number of therapeutics, like one would do with antidepressants or whatever, because then one can address those issues of equitability of access and so on, because you have the numbers to look at it, and you can do those sub-analysis retrospectively. So I think that's important. Of course, there's issues of equitability. That's a challenge in general in healthcare. If we turn the question round, to what can a digital therapeutics approach do, learning from the kind of way in which a software has just taken over our lives, and it seems everybody has got access nowadays compared with what they had before. So how can we learn from that, harness that energy, and yet at the same time produce outcomes that really matter to people? So it's not a digital toy we're talking about here. We're actually doing something that is going to make a difference to the population at large. It's an accessibility issue for people to go to a hospital, to go to a clinic, to see a psychologist. So I'm not ducking that issue. But perhaps when one thinks of an ecosystem of psychological care, of which digital therapeutics is part, that across that range of ways of delivering care, you're going to have a better opportunity to give choices about how you may receive your treatment, than you'd have with just having one channel or two channels.
Yeah,
it's a great point. It's a really important point.
Yeah. And except you're going to them in their homes rather than forcing them to come to the medical centers for their treatment. Very, very exciting. That's the whole concept. Wonderful.